Hello, everyone. A warm welcome back to our dedicated subscribers, and a special greeting to those joining us for the first time. You've just stepped into the perfect place for stories that will haunt your thoughts and leave you staring into the darkness, wide awake. Before we unravel today's eerie tale, share with us in the comments where you're tuning in from. Our community is growing rapidly, and it's thrilling to see just how far our reach extends. And remember, if you want to be among the first to experience our latest spine-chilling uploads, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell. Without it, you might miss out on the very stories that will keep you up at night. All right, let's dive into today's unsettling adventure. Story 1. The Frat Party Nightmare. It was Halloween night, my favorite time of the year. I had no plans initially, just looking forward to a quiet evening of Netflix and leftover pizza. But as I left my dorm that afternoon to grab a late brunch, a bright orange poster caught my eye on the bulletin board by the elevator. Alpha Sigma Phi Halloween Bash. Tonight at 9 p.m. Costumes required. I paused, reading it again. Alpha Sigma Phi? I didn't recognize the name. I'd been at Hudson University for 2 years now and thought I knew every fraternity on campus. Something about this one seemed off. It wasn't a frat I'd ever heard of, and I'd been to most of their events, though I wasn't heavily into the party scene. Still, the idea of staying in my room on Halloween started to feel boring. A party seemed like a good way to pass the time, and besides, I had a costume I'd been dying to wear. I decided, why not? What's the worst that could happen? When night fell, I pulled on my black witch's dress, threw on a wide-brimmed hat, and dusted glittery makeup across my cheeks. I wasn't going all out, but it was good enough for a last-minute decision. The night was chilly as I made my way toward the house listed on the flyer. It was a good 10-minute walk from campus, tucked in a quieter neighborhood. The street was eerily empty, with just a few straggling students in costumes walking in the opposite direction. As I neared the house, I could hear the unmistakable thump of bass, heavy music vibrating through the windows. Lights flashed inside, and I could see people moving around in the dark through the half-open curtains. I approached the front steps, suddenly feeling a bit out of place. I didn't know anyone at this frat. Still, the party inside sounded lively, and the familiar thrill of Halloween took over any hesitation. I knocked, but no one answered. The music drowned out everything. I pushed the door open, stepping into a room packed with people, loud conversations, and flashing strobe lights. The atmosphere hit me immediately. Laughter, bodies pressed together, and the smell of beer and sweat hung in the air. A guy in a zombie costume stood by the door and greeted me with a half-drunk smile. "Welcome to Alpha Sigma." Alex, he slurred his words slightly, his eyes lingering a bit too long as he looked me up and down. Something about him made me uncomfortable instantly. I'd heard rumors about this guy around campus, but I couldn't quite place them. I nodded politely, muttered a quick thanks, and moved away into the crowd. I wasn't here to make new friends, just to blend in and have a good time. I found the makeshift bar in the kitchen and grabbed myself a drink, just one. I'd be out of here in an hour or two. The party was in full swing now, and I could feel myself relaxing. The music was good, and people were starting to loosen up. I joined a group of girls near the dance floor, laughing and chatting as the beats of old-school hip-hop took over the room. For a while, everything felt normal. But then, something strange happened. It was after about 30 minutes, maybe a little more, that I noticed something wasn't right. I'd only had one drink vodka and soda, but I felt dizzy. Too dizzy. I tried to shake it off, thinking maybe I was just tired. but the spinning sensation in my head grew worse. My legs felt weak, and I could barely keep my balance. I leaned against the wall, pressing a hand to my forehead. This isn't right, Dot. I'd had drinks before, sure, but never felt this out of control after just one. Suddenly, I realized what might have happened. My stomach dropped. Had someone spiked my drink? I pushed through the crowd, my vision starting to blur around the edges. The faces of people seemed to merge into one long, swaying mess, their voices indistinct. I needed to get out of there. I just needed to get back to my dorm, lay down, and sleep this off. But as I stumbled toward the door, a hand grabbed my arm, pulling me back. It was Alex. "Hey, where are you going?" His voice was louder now, cutting through the haze. His grip tightened on my arm as he pulled me closer, his breath heavy with the smell of alcohol. I tried to jerk my arm away, but my body felt like lead. Everything was so heavy, Dot. "I have to go," I managed to mumble, my words slurring together. "I don't feel well." His eyes narrowed as he looked me over, his grin widening. "Don't be like that. Stay a little longer. You're just getting started." Right, his tone was playful, but there was something menacing behind it. I felt panic rising in my chest. The house was packed with people, but no one seemed to notice us, tucked away in the corner near the back door. I was too weak to push him off. The world was spinning so fast now, and I could feel myself swaying, barely able to stand upright. "Let me go," I whispered, but my voice was lost in the noise. He leaned in closer, his lips brushing against my ear. "You don't want to leave yet. The fun's just beginning." My heart raced. I had to get out of here, Dot. I couldn't think straight, but some primal part of my brain screamed at me to move, to run, to escape. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, I shoved him with everything I had left, breaking free of his grip. I stumbled backward, nearly falling as I dashed toward the front door. The room blurred around me, faces spinning like a carousel. I didn't even stop to grab my jacket. I just ran. The cold air outside hit me like a slap in the face, but it didn't help clear my head. My legs wobbled beneath me as I half walked, half ran down the street, the frat house fading behind me. I could still hear the thumping of the music, but it grew distant with each step. My dorm wasn't far, but it felt like miles. By the time I reached the door, my vision had gone almost completely blurry, and my hands trembled as I fumbled with the key. I collapsed inside, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. The room spun around me, and I could barely make it to my bed. I kicked off my shoes and crawled under the covers, every part of me shaking. What was in that drink? My mind raced, fear gripping my chest. I knew I should call someone, campus security, the police, anyone, but I couldn't think straight. My head pounded, my limbs felt like lead, and my eyes fluttered shut before I could even reach for my phone. I woke up hours later, my mouth dry and head pounding. The early morning light filtered through the window, and for a moment I thought maybe it had all been a bad dream. But then I heard the sound of my dresser drawers being opened and closed. Slowly, deliberately. I froze, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might break through my chest. Someone was in my room. I opened my eyes, but my vision was still fuzzy, my body still weak. I turned my head slowly, and that's when I saw him. Alex. He was standing by my dresser, rummaging through my things, his back to me. My blood ran cold. How did he get in? I realized with a sinking feeling that I must have forgotten to lock the door when I stumbled into the room last night. I tried to sit up, but my limbs felt heavy, my movements sluggish. My mind screamed at me to do something, anything, but my body wouldn't cooperate. Alex must have sensed my movement because he turned around slowly, a twisted smile on his face. "You shouldn't have left the party so early," he said, his voice low, almost mocking. I forced myself to move, pushing my body off the bed with all the strength I could muster. My head spun as I stumbled toward the door, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. Alex just stood there, watching me, amused. I grabbed my phone off the desk and fumbled to unlock it, my fingers trembling. I hit the call button, not even sure who I was dialing -911, a friend, anyone. "Get out," I finally managed to yell, my voice weak but filled with desperation. He didn't move. For a moment I thought he might actually come closer. But then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the room, shutting the door quietly behind him. I collapsed against the wall, my breath coming in short, panic gasps. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold onto my phone. What had just happened? What had he been planning to do if I hadn't woken up? The police came later that morning and I filed a report, though I had little faith that anything would come of it. Alex was connected. His cousin was some big shot in local politics, and guys like him always seemed to get away with everything. But I didn't care anymore. I just wanted to be safe. I never went to another frat party after that. Halloween, once my favorite holiday, now only brought back memories of that night. These days, I spend it handing out candy to trick-or-treaters from the safety of my home, where I can lock the door and keep the nightmares at bay. But I'll never forget the way Alex looked at me that night, the way he acted as if I was just a thing to him, something to control and manipulate. It haunts me still. Story 2. The drunk driving tragedy. It was the night of the state hockey championship, and we had just won the biggest game of our high school careers. The celebration was immediate, wild, and full of reckless energy. Our team captain, Ethan, lived in a massive house just outside of town, so naturally he threw a party that night. His place was the perfect spot for an all-night rager, big yard, a pool, and most importantly, no parents around to shut it down. Pretty much the entire school showed up. I was there with my 3 best friends, Max, Jake, and Caleb. We had all been on the team together since freshman year, and tonight, after winning the state championship, it felt like we were on top of the world. The party was everything you'd expect: loud music, people drinking way more than they should, and the constant hum of excited conversations as we relived the game's best moments. By midnight, the party was still going strong. I couldn't even remember how many drinks I'd had by that point, and the same went for Max, Jake, and Caleb. We were wasted, but we didn't care. We were invincible, or at least that's how it felt. Winning that championship made everything else seem small, and the alcohol only amplified that sense of euphoria. Sometime around 2 a.m., the party started to wind down. The music was still playing, but people were leaving, either crashing in different rooms of the house or finding their way home. That's when Max, who was somehow the least drunk of all of us, suggested we head out too. "I'm good to drive," he said, holding up his keys with a sloppy grin. I didn't question it. None of us did. In hindsight, I don't know why we thought it was a good idea. Maybe it was the booze, maybe it was the adrenaline from winning, but we just piled into Max's car without a second thought. Max slid into the driver's seat, and Jake took the passenger side while Caleb and I climbed into the back. I remember the cold leather seats and the way the car smelled of stale beer. I remember laughing about something Jake said, though now I couldn't tell you what it was. But what I remember most clearly was how quickly everything went wrong. We hadn't even been driving for 5 minutes when the car started to veer. Max swerved left, then right, struggling to keep control. At first, I thought he was just messing around, trying to scare us for fun. But the way the car kept lurching, I realized he wasn't joking. I sat up straighter in my seat, my heart pounding. "Max, slow down," man, I called from the back. But my voice didn't carry the urgency I felt. It still sounded like I was laughing, like we were all still having fun. Then it happened. 1 second we were on the road, and the next, the car felt like it was flying. The front wheels must have hit something because the entire car lifted off the ground for a split second. It felt weightless, but not in a good way. My stomach dropped, and before I could even register what was happening, we crashed. The impact was immediate and violent. The front of the car slammed into something solid, maybe a tree, maybe a rock. I didn't know, and the entire vehicle flipped. The world spun around me in a blur of glass, metal, and deafening noise. I felt the crunch of the roof as it caved in, and the searing pain in my leg as something heavy pinned it down. Then everything went dark. I don't know how long I was out, but when I came to, I was in excruciating pain. My left leg throbbed with a deep, sharp agony that radiated through my whole body. The world was upside down, and I could smell gasoline and burnt rubber. My head felt like it was splitting open, but I could still hear the faint groans of someone next to me. It was Caleb. He was slumped in the seat beside me, barely conscious, his breathing shallow and labored. Caleb, are you okay?" I croaked, my throat dry and scratchy. He didn't respond at first, just kept breathing in those shallow, uneven gasps. Panic gripped my chest. I could tell something was wrong. I tried to move, but my leg was pinned beneath the crumpled frame of the car. I couldn't shift it at all. "Jake?" "Max," I called out, my voice hoarse. No answer. My heart started to race as I realized how quiet the front of the car was. Too quiet. With trembling hands, I fumbled for my phone, the cracked screen barely lighting up as I unlocked it. Somehow, despite the crash, it still worked. I dialed 911, my hands shaking so hard that I nearly dropped the phone. "There's been an accident," I rasped into the phone. "We need help. Please." The paramedics arrived faster than I expected, but the wait felt like an eternity. When they pulled us out of the wreckage, I could barely stay conscious. They lifted me onto a stretcher, the pain in my leg nearly unbearable, and as they carried me toward the ambulance, I finally saw what had happened. The car had flipped over a guardrail and crashed into a ditch. The entire front end was crushed, and through the shattered windshield, I could see Max and Jake. They weren't moving. I woke up in the hospital the next morning, groggy from the painkillers. My leg was in a cast, and my parents were sitting beside me, their eyes red from crying. When I saw their faces, I knew. They didn't make it. Did they? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. My mom shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, honey, Max and Jake, they didn't survive." The weight of those words hit me like a punch to the gut. Max and Jake, two of my best friends, were gone. Just like that. I couldn't even process it. The grief, the guilt, the shock, it all came crashing down on me at once, and I broke down in tears. The nurse came in a little while later to check on me, and that's when she told me the other news. My leg had been badly damaged in the crash. They had done what they could, but the injury was too severe. They had to amputate it. I stared at her, numb. I didn't even have the strength to be angry or upset. My leg was gone. My friends were gone. Everything had changed in the span of a few minutes. In the weeks that followed, Caleb and I clung to each other for support. He had survived the crash too, but his injuries were serious. He was paralyzed from the waist down. The doctor said he'd never walk again. We both knew how lucky we were to be alive, but that didn't take away the pain. The memories of that night haunted us, especially the knowledge that we could have made different choices that would have saved our friends' lives. I never touched alcohol again after that. Neither did Caleb. We started attending AA meetings together, not because we were alcoholics, but because we needed a way to process the guilt, the grief, the overwhelming sense of loss. Eventually, we began running those meetings, helping others avoid the same mistakes we had made. We still talk about that night sometimes. Not often, but sometimes. We both know we'll never forget it. The scars, physical and emotional, run too deep. Every now and then, when I'm alone, I think about Max and Jake. I think about what might have happened if we just stayed at Ethan's house a little longer, or if we'd called a cab instead of getting into that car. I think about how quickly everything can change with just one bad decision. Now, every step I take with my prosthetic leg is a reminder of that night, a reminder of what we lost. But it's also a reminder of how lucky I am to still be here, still moving forward, one step at a time. Story 3. The Summer Camp Horror. I was 16 when it happened, and I haven't forgotten a single detail since. Every summer since I was 9, I had attended Camp Willow Ridge, nestled deep in the Berkshire Mountains of Massachusetts. It was a place I loved, where I'd made lifelong friends, shared secrets by the campfire, and spent lazy afternoons swimming in the cool, clear lake. But the summer of 2018 was different. It was the summer I met Ben. Ben was new to the camp, and I noticed him right away because, well, he was hard not to notice. He had this quiet confidence about him, dark, tousled hair, a bit of a brooding look, and a smile that was both charming and disarming. I remember thinking, who is this guy, and why haven't I seen him here before? We met on the first day, during orientation. He introduced himself with that same easy smile, and before I knew it, we were talking like we'd known each other for years. I was drawn to him, almost against my better judgment. He was different from the other guys at camp, more mature, mysterious, and I found myself gravitating toward him in a way that made my heart race. Within days, we were inseparable. My friends teased me, saying I'd abandoned them for my summer boyfriend, but it didn't matter. I spent every moment I could with Ben hiking the trails, swimming in the lake, sneaking away to quiet spots in the woods, just to talk. And at first, it was everything I had ever wanted. I felt alive, like I was living my very own summer romance. But as the days passed, something started to change. At first, it was small things, little details that I brushed off as no big deal. Ben would ask me where I was going, who I was hanging out with, and when I didn't answer fast enough, his tone would shift, like he was annoyed. He became possessive, always wanting to know where I was, who I was with, even if I was just spending time with my friends. But then he'd flash that charming smile, and I'd forget the tension, pushing aside the uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. One evening, we were sitting by the lake, the sun setting behind the trees, casting everything in a warm, golden light. I remember it so clearly because it was the first time I noticed the change in him. I was talking about my plans for the fall, how I couldn't wait to start my junior year of high school, and he just stared at me. His expression was blank, his usual smile gone, replaced by something I couldn't quite place. It was as if, for a moment, he was a completely different person. Ben, I said, laughing nervously. Are you okay? His eyes flicked to mine, and he smiled again, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. Yeah, of course, he said, his voice too smooth, too controlled. But the feeling lingered, that gnawing sense that something wasn't right. The night it all went wrong started like any other. We had our usual evening activities, dinner in the mess hall, a campfire with s'mores, and some light-hearted banter with the other campers. I had showered and gotten ready for bed, slipping into my pajamas and brushing my teeth while my cabin mates chatted quietly, the glow of the moon filtering through the windows. It was past 10:30 when we turned out the lights, and one by one, everyone fell asleep. Everyone but me. I've always been a light sleeper, and that night I was restless. I lay there in my bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of the forest outside, the wind rustling the leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional creak of the cabin settling. That's when I heard it. The door to our cabin creaked open, so softly that at first I thought I was imagining it. I propped myself up on my elbows, listening. It was dark, too dark to see clearly, but I could feel the presence of someone standing at the door. My heart started to race. I was about to call out, thinking it was one of the counselors doing a late-night check-in, but then I felt it. A slow, deliberate tug on my blanket. For a second, I thought maybe it was one of the girls playing a prank, but the touch was too cold, too careful. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The blanket slid down a little more, and then I felt it someone's hand, cold and clammy, brushing against my leg, reaching for the waistband of my pajama pants. I reacted before I even had time to think. My hand shot out, grabbing the flashlight I always kept by my bed, and in one swift motion, I flicked it on, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. What I saw made my blood run cold. It was Ben. He was standing over me, caught in the act, his eyes wide with shock, and something else, something darker. For a moment, neither of us moved. I was frozen in place, my breath stuck in my throat, the flashlight trembling in my hand as I pointed it straight at his face. "What the hell are you doing?" I whispered, my voice shaky but furious. Ben didn't answer. His face was a mask of confusion and anger, like he hadn't expected to get caught. Slowly he backed away, the beam of light following him as he retreated toward the door. And then, without a word, he turned and bolted, disappearing into the night. I sat there, shaking, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. The other girls in the cabin were starting to wake up, groggy and confused, asking what was going on. But I couldn't find the words to explain it to them. I couldn't even explain it to myself. The next morning, I told the camp director everything. I couldn't stay quiet about it. I didn't care what Ben's excuses would be, or how he might twist the story. I knew what had happened, and I wasn't going to let him get away with it. The director took it seriously, thank God. By the end of breakfast, Ben was gone. Permanently. He was placed on the camp's do not return list, and the counselors made sure to check in with me several times throughout the day. But even with Ben gone, I couldn't shake the feeling of violation, the fear that gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. The rest of the summer passed uneventfully, but I was never the same after that night. Ben had left a scar, not just on my mind, but on my sense of safety. I thought about him constantly, wondering what would have happened if I hadn't woken up in time, if I hadn't grabbed the flashlight. The idea of it made me sick to my stomach. When I returned home at the end of the summer, I couldn't bring myself to talk about it with anyone, not even my closest friends. I buried the experience, hoping it would fade into the background of my memory, but it never did. It still haunts me. Now, years later, I've come to terms with what happened. It took a long time, and it wasn't easy. Trust, for me, became something that had to be earned, not freely given. I haven't heard from Ben since that summer, and honestly, I don't care to. I don't know what happened to him after he left the camp, and I don't want to know. What matters is that I'm moving forward, slowly but surely. And if there's one thing I've learned from that summer, it's this: always trust your gut. If something feels off, if someone gives you that uneasy feeling, don't ignore it. It's there for a reason. Story 4. The haunted pizza delivery. It was past midnight, and I was bone tired. I'd been driving around for hours, delivering pizza after pizza to drunks and late-night snackers, but this was my last delivery of the night. After this, I could finally go home, take a hot shower, and collapse into bed. That's what I kept telling myself as I turned down the unfamiliar road, squinting through the rain-soaked windshield at the address on my GPS. The rain had been relentless all evening. Thick sheets of water pounded against my windshield, blurring the road ahead into a smear of black and gray. My windshield wipers were working overtime, but they weren't doing much. It was like trying to clear a waterfall with a toothbrush. I leaned forward, my face nearly pressed against the glass, as I navigated down the narrow, twisting road that seemed to lead to the middle of nowhere. The further I drove, the less familiar things became. There were no streetlights here, no houses with cozy, glowing windows, just trees tall, dark, looming trees lining either side of the road like silent sentinels. The road itself was barely wide enough for my car, and with every twist and turn, I half expected a deer to leap out of the shadows and crash into my windshield. I checked the delivery address again, hoping I'd made some kind of mistake, but no, this was it. 1357 Briar Hollow Road. The name sounded like something out of a cheap horror movie, and as I glanced at the dark, desolate surroundings, I couldn't help but feel a shiver run down my spine. It didn't help that my GPS was starting to freak out. The signal had been flickering in and out ever since I turned onto Briar Hollow Road, and now the screen had frozen, the little arrow stuck in place, while the voice cheerfully announced that I had arrived at my destination. I slowed to a crawl, peering through the rain, looking for any sign of a house. There it was, just barely visible in the distance. My headlights finally caught on something, a shape looming out of the darkness, tall and weathered. At first I thought it was a barn or maybe some kind of storage shed, but as I got closer I realized it was a house. Or at least it used to be. The place was a wreck. The roof sagged in the middle like it was about to collapse, and the paint had peeled away in long, ragged strips, revealing the bare wood underneath. The windows were dark and cracked, and the front yard was overgrown with weeds that reached up to my knees as I stepped out of the car. I hesitated, standing there in the rain, clutching the pizza box to my chest like a lifeline. No one could actually live here, I thought. The house looked like it hadn't seen a human being in years. But the address matched, and there was no mistaking the faint glow of light coming from one of the upstairs windows. Someone was home, or at least someone or something was in there. I walked up to the rusty gate that separated the yard from the road. It creaked as I pushed it open, the sound cutting through the steady patter of rain. The path leading to the front door was little more than cracked stones half hidden under the weeds, and I nearly tripped twice as I made my way up. Every instinct in my body was telling me to turn around, get back in the car, and leave. But I needed to finish this delivery. I'd already come this far. When I reached the front door, I hesitated again. There was no doorbell, just an old tarnished knocker shaped like some kind of animal, maybe a lion. Though it was so worn down, it was hard to tell. I gave it 3 sharp raps, the sound echoing eerily through the house. I waited. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time, my knuckles starting to sting from the cold and the rain. Still nothing. I glanced back at my car, wondering if I should just leave the pizza on the doorstep and go, but something kept me there. Maybe I just didn't knock loud enough, I thought. I raised my hand to knock again, but before I could, the door creaked open. It opened so slowly, so silently, that for a moment I wasn't even sure it had moved. But then I saw a thin sliver of darkness, just wide enough for me to see the faint outline of a hallway beyond. The light from my car's headlights barely reached inside, casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. "Hello," I called, stepping forward just a little. My voice sounded strange in the stillness, swallowed up by the darkness. "Pizza delivery." No response. The house was completely silent, save for the distant sound of rain tapping against the roof. I shifted the pizza box in my hands, unsure of what to do. "Just leave it," a voice in my head whispered. "Leave the pizza and G.O. dot." But then, a noise. Faint, but unmistakable. A creaking sound, like the floorboards shifting under someone's weight. "Hello," I called again, a little louder this time. My heart was starting to pound in my chest. I took another step toward the door, peering inside, trying to get a better look. That's when I saw it. A figure. At first, I thought it was just a shadow cast by the flickering light outside. But as my eyes adjusted to the dimness, I realized it wasn't a shadow. It was a person, or at least it was the outline of a person, tall, thin, standing motionless just beyond the doorway, barely visible in the gloom. Your pizza's here," I said, my voice trembling slightly. The figure didn't move, didn't say a word, just stood there, watching me. Something wasn't right. I could feel it in my bones, in the way the air around me seemed to grow colder, pressing in on me from all sides. My skin prickled, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I stepped back, clutching the pizza box tighter, my mind racing. Why isn't he saying anything? Why is he just standing there? I'll just leave this here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I turned to leave, but before I could take more than a step, the door opened wider, creaking on its rusty hinges. The figure didn't move, but the darkness seemed to swell, creeping toward me like an invisible fog. "Wait." The voice was so quiet, I almost didn't hear it. But it was there, low and raspy, like it hadn't been used in years. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "Come inside." My blood ran cold. I couldn't see his face, couldn't even be sure it was a he. The figure was just a silhouette, barely more than a shadow, but the voice. There was something wrong with it. Something that made every instinct in my body scream at me to get the hell out of there. I really should go," I stammered, taking another step back. "I've got more deliveries." The figure didn't respond, just stood there, watching, waiting. My feet felt like they were glued to the ground, my mind torn between wanting to run and the strange, inexplicable urge to go inside. "No," I told myself, "you need to leave. Now dot." I took another step back, and that's when the figure moved. It was subtle, just a slight shift, a tilt of the head, but it was enough to send a jolt of fear through me. The figure's hand reached out, pale and thin, fingers long and bony, like the branches of a dead tree. "Come inside," the voice repeated, louder this time, more insistent. I turned and bolted. I don't remember much after that. I know I ran faster than I'd ever run in my life, the rain soaking through my clothes, the pizza box slipping from my hands and landing somewhere in the mud. I sprinted down the path, nearly tripping over the uneven stones, my breath coming in ragged gasps. By the time I reached my car, I was soaked to the bone, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock the door. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of there, tires screeching against the wet pavement. I didn't stop driving until I was back on the main road, far away from that house, far away from whatever the hell had just happened. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands still shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. My breath was coming in short, panic bursts, and it took me a few minutes to calm down, to convince myself that I was safe. But as I sat there, staring out into the rain-soaked darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That somehow, even though I'd left that house behind, something had followed me. The next day, I went back to the pizza shop, determined to forget about the whole thing. I didn't tell anyone about what had happened, didn't want to sound like a lunatic. But when my boss asked why I'd left the pizza undelivered, I didn't have a good answer. I just shrugged, mumbled something about getting lost in the storm, and hoped he'd let it go. But he didn't. Briar Hollow, he said, frowning. That place hasn't had anyone living there in years. It's been abandoned since, what, the 80s? Maybe longer. I stared at him, my heart skipping a beat. Abandoned? You sure you got the address right, he asked, raising an eyebrow, because no one orders pizza out there. I didn't argue, didn't try to explain. I just nodded and went back to work, trying to push the memory of that night to the back of my mind. But I couldn't forget. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the image of that figure standing in the doorway, couldn't forget the sound of that voice, quiet and raspy, calling me inside. I never went back to Briar Hollow Road, never delivered to that house again. And even now, years later, I still can't explain what happened that night. All I know is that something was in that house, something that shouldn't have been there. And whatever it was waiting for me. Story 5. The post office threat. It was a quiet afternoon at the post office, the kind of slow day that dragged on forever. The steady hum of machines filled the air as letters and packages moved down the conveyor belt in their orderly fashion. It wasn't my dream job, far from it, but it paid the bills. Most days were pretty routine, filled with sorting mail, answering phones, and dealing with customers who were either in too much of a rush or just plain confused. That afternoon, though, something happened that still haunts me to this day. I was sitting at my desk, going through some paperwork when the phone rang. It was a simple, repetitive task, so I wasn't paying much attention when I picked up the receiver. My usual greeting rolling off my tongue, automatically Maine Post Office. How can I help you? There was a pause on the other end of the line. Just a moment of silence, long enough to make me glance at the phone to see if the call had dropped. Then, finally, a man's voice came through, casual, almost friendly. Hi there. Would you sign my petition? I blinked, caught off guard by the question. A petition? Who calls a post office asking about a petition? For a second, I thought maybe it was some sort of scam or a prank call, but the man didn't sound like he was joking. His tone was light, conversational, and completely serious. I'm sorry, what petition are you talking about? I asked, trying to keep my voice polite. We don't handle petitions here. There was another pause, this one shorter. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. It was harder now, colder, with an edge of impatience. Just sign the petition. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something about his tone set me on edge, but I forced myself to stay calm. I didn't want to escalate the situation, especially if this guy was just some bored prankster. Look, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, I'm afraid I can't help you with that. This is a post office. But he wasn't listening. His voice grew sharper, more demanding. Sign the petition. Now. I felt my stomach twist. This wasn't normal, even for a prank call. There was something unsettling about the way he spoke, as if he wasn't asking for anything specific, but was still somehow serious. It was almost like he was issuing an order, a command that I couldn't quite make sense of. I don't know what you're talking about, I said, trying not to let my growing unease creep into my voice. If you need help with something, you're going to have to be more specific. The line went quiet again. For a second, I thought maybe he'd hung up. I was about to put the phone down when his voice came through again, low and menacing this time. Sign the petition, or I'll follow you home and hurt your dog. My heart stopped. What? The words hit me like a punch to the gut, my mind scrambling to make sense of what I'd just heard. I didn't even have a dog, but the threat felt personal. The way he said it, so calm, so cold, sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't a prank anymore. Whoever this guy was, he wasn't messing around. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady, but I could hear the tremble in it. Who is this? The man chuckled, the sound low and mocking. Billy Joe Bob, he said, like it was supposed to mean something. I clenched the phone tighter, my heart pounding in my chest. Billy Joe Bob? Was this guy serious? Was he trying to be funny? I didn't care. I just wanted to get him off the phone and figure out what the hell was going on. Listen, if you're going to make threats, you better be serious about it, I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. My palms were sweating, and I could feel the pulse of adrenaline in my veins. What do you want? He ignored my question. Sign the petition, he repeated, his voice dripping with impatience. It's not that hard. I stared at the phone, my mind racing. Was this guy local? Did he know where I lived? Was he watching me right now? I glanced around the office, but everything seemed normal. The other employees were going about their business, oblivious to the strange conversation I was having. I decided to push back. Where are you? I asked, my voice stronger now, angrier. You want to talk about this in person? The man didn't answer. Instead, he let out another cold, humorless chuckle. You thought today was just another day, didn't you? Guess what? Surprise. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the other end of the line. It was so sharp and sudden that I flinched, almost dropping the phone. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what the sound was. A gunshot. My heart raced, my thoughts spinning out of control. Was this guy serious? Did he just shoot something? Someone? Was he coming for me next? I forced myself to stay calm, even though my hands were shaking and my mind was screaming at me to hang up. But I didn't. Instead, I tightened my grip on the phone and said the only thing I could think of. I'm not going anywhere, I said, my voice low, defiant. There was silence on the other end. For a moment, I thought the call had dropped. But then I heard it again, that low, cold chuckle, followed by the sound of the line going dead. I sat there for a long time after that, just staring at the phone in my hand, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The office buzzed with the usual activity around me, phones ringing, machines whirring, people chatting, but all of it felt distant, like I was in a bubble, separated from the world. Had that really happened? Had I just gotten a death threat over the phone? And what the hell was with the petition? I replayed the conversation in my head, trying to piece it together, but none of it made sense. It was like some twisted joke with a gunshot. That had been real. I was sure of it. I finally stood up, my legs shaky, and walked over to my manager's office. I told him what had happened about the phone call, the threats, the gunshot. He looked at me with wide eyes, clearly as confused as I was. "Did you get his number?" he asked. I shook my head. The call had been blocked, no caller ID. Of course, whoever this guy was, he knew how to stay hidden. "Do you want to call the police?" my manager asked, but I could tell he wasn't sure if that was the right move. What were the police going to do? It wasn't like they could track down a blocked call with no leads. And what would I even tell them? I shrugged, still trying to process everything. "I don't know," I said. Maybe. It could have just been a prank. But even as I said the words, I didn't believe them. Something about that call had been different, more deliberate, more dangerous. For the rest of the afternoon, I couldn't focus. Every time the phone rang, I jumped, half expecting the man to be on the other end, laughing at me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, looking out the windows, scanning the parking lot for any sign of someone watching me. But there was nothing. No one. By the time my shift ended, I was a nervous wreck. I walked out to my car, scanning the parking lot for any sign of a stranger lurking in the shadows. My breath came in short, shallow bursts as I unlocked the door, my hands trembling. Every instinct told me to get out of there, to get home and lock the door behind me. But as I drove home, the fear didn't fade. In fact, it only grew stronger. That night, I locked every door and window in my house, checking them twice, 3 times, before finally retreating to my bedroom. My heart was still pounding as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak, every distant noise. Every time I heard something, I would tense up, my breath catching in my throat, convinced that the man from the phone call was outside, waiting. I didn't sleep much that night. The next day at work, I tried to act normal. I didn't tell anyone else about the call, and my manager didn't bring it up again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Every time the phone rang, my heart would skip a beat, and I'd tense up, half expecting that cold, mocking voice to be on the other end, waiting to finish what he'd started. Days turned into weeks, and the call slowly faded into the background of my life. But it never really left me. I stopped walking home after dark, stopped taking the same routes to work. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, convinced that the man from the phone call was still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike. But nothing ever happened. No follow-up call, no strange visitors, no mysterious figures lurking in the shadows. For a while, I even started to believe that maybe it really had been just a prank. A sick, twisted prank, but nothing more. But even. Now, years later, I can't forget that call. I can't forget the sound of his voice, the way he said my name, the way he threatened my non-existent dog. And most of all, I can't forget the sound of that gunshot echoing through the phone. A reminder that sometimes the scariest things aren't the monsters you see on TV or in the movies. They're the ones you never see coming.